He fought his first battle at 15 years old. He served as a mercenary warrior across Russia, fought for the Byzantine Emperor in Sicily, Bulgaria, and possibly as far east as Mesopotamia. He accumulated more gold than any Viking of his generation. He became king of Norway. He fought Denmark for 15 years. And at 51 years old, he sailed 300 longships toward England to claim one final crown. His name was Harald Sigurdsson. History would call him Hardrada, the hard ruler. And his death on September 25, 1066 is the moment historians mark as the end of the Viking Age. Harald Hardrada's life reads like every Viking saga condensed into a single biography. Exile at 15. Mercenary in Russia. Elite warrior of the Byzantine Empire. King of Norway at 32. And then, 50 years old, the last great representative of an age that was already ending, one final audacious campaign to remake the map of the medieval world. He nearly succeeded. What stopped him was not an army. It was one English arrow. And the world that followed his death would be unrecognizable to any Viking who had come before him. This is the story of the man who stood at the hinge point of history, the last of the great Viking warriors at the moment when the world was moving on from everything the Viking Age had meant. He did not go gently. He went with 300 ships, 10,000 warriors, and the absolute conviction that England was his. He was wrong. But what his failure set in motion changed the course of European history forever. Harald Hardrada. The last Viking. And the man whose death made the modern world possible. Harald Sigurdsson was born around 1015 in Ringerike, Norway, the son of a minor chieftain named Sigurdsson. His mother Estrid was also the mother of Olaf Haraldsson, which made Olaf his half-brother, and which connected Harald to the most significant figure in Norwegian Christianity. When Olaf attempted to reclaim the Norwegian throne from the Danish king Knut in 1030, 15-year-old Harald was at his side. He should not have been, he was a boy, not yet a warrior. He went anyway. That refusal to accept limits defined his entire life. The Battle of Stiklestad was a defeat. Olaf was killed and would later be venerated as Saint Olaf, patron saint of Norway. Harald was wounded in the fighting and forced to flee. He was 15 years old, wounded, and in exile, the son of a minor chieftain with a dead half-brother and no path home. He went east. Toward Russia. Toward whatever the world had for a Norse warrior with nothing to lose and everything to prove. He would not return to Norway for 15 years. The exile that began at Stiklestad was not merely a period of waiting. It was the crucible that made Harald Hardrada. Every year in Russia, every campaign in the Byzantine service, every battle in Sicily and Bulgaria was a layer added to a warrior who was already formidable and was becoming something extraordinary. The boy who survived Stiklestad would spend 15 years being forged by the hardest experiences the medieval world could provide. What came back to Norway in 1045 was not the wounded teenager who had fled. It was something that Norway, and eventually England, would have serious reason to fear. After several years in the service of Yaroslav the Wise, Grand Prince of Kiev, during which he distinguished himself enough to propose marriage to Yaroslav's daughter Elisiv, a proposal accepted, Harald moved south to Constantinople around 1034. He joined the Varangian Guard, the elite corps of Norse and Anglo-Saxon warriors who served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor. It was the most prestigious military position available to a Norse mercenary, and Harald rose through its ranks with the same relentless effectiveness he brought to everything he attempted. The Varangian Guard saw action across the Byzantine world, and Harald saw all of it. He fought against Arab forces in Sicily. He campaigned in Bulgaria. He made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He is said to have fought in engagements as far east as Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, which would make his military career one of the most geographically extensive of any Viking who ever lived. Each campaign added to his wealth and his reputation. Byzantine sources describe him as a formidable and ambitious officer. He was accumulating not just gold but the strategic knowledge of how the most sophisticated military organization in the Christian world operated. His time in Constantinople ended dramatically. Byzantine sources indicate he was involved in a palace coup that removed Emperor Michael V in 1042. Some accounts, possibly embellished by the sagas, claim Harald was personally involved in blinding the deposed emperor. Whether literally true or not, the accounts reflect a man who operated at the absolute center of Byzantine power politics, not merely as a sword for hire but as a figure of sufficient standing to be involved in the making and unmaking of emperors. He left Constantinople with an enormous fortune in gold. He was ready to go home. Norway did not know what was coming. Harald returned to Norway in 1045 with a fleet, a fortune, and an army of veterans who had fought across the known world. His nephew Magnus the Good was on the throne, the son of Saint Olaf, legitimate and popular. Harald was not in a position to simply take the throne by force. He negotiated. He offered Magnus half his Byzantine gold in exchange for sharing the Norwegian kingship. Magnus, practical and recognizing that a man with Harald's resources and reputation was more dangerous as an enemy than a co-ruler, agreed. They ruled together for 1 year. Then Magnus died, of illness, possibly from a fall from a horse, leaving Harald sole king of Norway. He was 32 years old and king of Norway. The country he had left as a wounded boy was now his. What he did with it revealed the same qualities that had defined his entire life: ambition that was never satisfied, a willingness to use force as the first rather than the last resort, and a strategic intelligence that could see multiple moves ahead even when the emotions of the moment pushed toward immediate action. He immediately began the project of consolidating royal power within Norway, crushing the regional aristocracy that had always limited Norwegian kings, and then turning his eyes toward Denmark. He earned his epithet during these years: Hardrada, the hard ruler. He was not a king who governed through consensus or traditional accommodation with the aristocracy. He broke the regional warlords who had always been able to constrain Norwegian kings, disbanded their private armies, and concentrated military and political power in the crown with a ruthlessness that made him feared and resented in equal measure. Norway had never had a king quite like this. It would not have one again. He had turned his kingdom into an instrument. Now he needed something to do with it. From 1047 to 1064, Harald Hardrada waged almost continuous warfare against Denmark and its king, Sven Estridsson. The war was long, expensive, and ultimately inconclusive, but not because Harald was losing. He won most of the battles. He devastated Danish coastal settlements. He destroyed Danish fleets. He brought Denmark to the point of genuine exhaustion. But Denmark would not submit. Sven kept fighting, kept rebuilding, kept refusing the terms that would have acknowledged Norwegian supremacy over the Scandinavian world. The Battle of Nis in 1062 was the military peak of the Danish War, a massive naval engagement in which Harald destroyed the Danish fleet and left Sven's power shattered. It should have ended the war. Instead, Sven retreated, rebuilt, and continued. And Harald, surveying the strategic situation with the cold clarity that had always been his defining quality, eventually calculated that the costs of continuing outweighed the benefits of a victory that Denmark refused to acknowledge. In 1064 the two kings made peace, each recognizing the other's sovereignty. Harald had fought Denmark for 15 years. He had won every major engagement. He had gained nothing permanent. The peace with Denmark freed Harald to look elsewhere. He was 50 years old, his treasury depleted by 15 years of naval warfare, his aristocracy resentful of the taxes that had funded it, and his legacy, despite the Nis and a dozen other victories, curiously incomplete for a man of his ambitions. Then, in January 1066, King Edward the Confessor of England died without an heir. The succession crisis that erupted offered Harald Hardrada one final opportunity. He took it with both hands and no hesitation. Harald's claim to the English throne was complex and, by modern legal standards, extremely thin. It rested on an agreement between his predecessor Magnus and the Danish king Harthacnut, a deal that neither party's successors were bound by and which most English people had never heard of. But Harald was not primarily a lawyer. He was a warrior with the most experienced army in the Viking world, and his claim was the justification for an invasion he intended to win by force rather than by legal argument. The catalyst was Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of the new English king Harald Godwinson. Tostig had been driven from his position as Earl of Northumbria in 1065 and harbored a fierce hatred for his brother. He came to Harald with a simple offer: his local knowledge, his connections in northern England, and his influence in Scotland and Orkney in exchange for Harald's fleet and army. Harald had already been considering the English claim. Tostig's offer resolved his remaining doubts. By spring 1066 he was building the greatest invasion force Norway had assembled in a generation. He prepared with characteristic thoroughness. Before sailing, he named his eldest son Magnus as co-king of Norway, understanding that a man of 50 going to war against an English king and a Norman duke simultaneously needed to secure his succession. He took his wife Queen Elisive and his daughters with him. This was no raid but an intended permanent conquest. 300 longships. Somewhere between 8 and 10,000 warriors. The last great Viking fleet setting out on the last great Viking campaign. In September 1066 they sailed south. The invasion route took Harald's fleet south via Orkney and Shetland, where additional forces joined from the island earls. By the time the fleet reached the English coast it had grown substantially from its Norwegian complement. Combined with reinforcements picked up in Orkney, the Norwegian army most likely numbered between 7,000 and 9,000 men. They landed on the Yorkshire coast in mid-September, immediately beginning the systematic terrorizing of the English north that was the classic Viking opening to any campaign. Scarborough refused to surrender and was burned as a lesson to every other town watching from a distance. On September 20th they defeated a northern English army led by Edwin, Earl of Mercia, and his brother Morcar, Earl of Northumbria, at the Battle of Fulford, outside York. It was a comprehensive victory. The northern English defense had been broken in a single afternoon. York, the great city of the north, second city of England, was now open. Harold accepted its surrender. He arranged for hostages and supplies to be delivered to him at Stamford Bridge, east of York. His campaign was proceeding perfectly. 5 days later, everything changed. Harald Hardrada had achieved in 5 days what the entire Danish war had failed to achieve in 15 years, a decisive military victory on his enemy's soil, a major city in his hands, and the northern English military power broken. He was, by any objective assessment, on the verge of winning. The English king Harald Godwinson was 200 miles to the south, watching the Norman coast for William's fleet. The north was Harald's. Everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. He could not know that Harald was already marching north. And he could not know how fast. Harald Godwinson received news of the Norwegian landing and the defeat at Fulford within days. He faced an impossible choice: stay in the south watching for William's invasion from Normandy, or march north immediately to deal with Harald. He marched north. The decision was controversial then and historians still debate it. But Harald was a man of action and his instinct was always to move fast. He marched his housecarls and as many thanes as he could gather day and night, covering approximately 200 miles in 4 days, one of the fastest military marches in medieval English history. The speed of Harald's march was itself a weapon. Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge had no idea the English king was coming. He had sent roughly a third of his force back to the ships at Rickcall. The army was relaxed, awaiting the hostages and supplies promised by York, not expecting battle. Some accounts describe the Norwegian warriors in shirt sleeves, their armor left with the ships, enjoying an unseasonably warm September afternoon. They were caught completely off guard. The English army appeared on the road from York before a single Norwegian scout had reported their approach. The English king Harald Godwinson, despite the threat of an invasion from the south, had marched northwards with his army, received intelligence of this and was victorious over the Norwegians in an historic surprise attack. The surprise was total. Harald had minutes to organize his forces rather than hours. The battle that followed was fought at a significant disadvantage. Many of his warriors were unarmored, his full force was divided between Stamford Bridge and Rickcall, and the English had the psychological and physical momentum of men who had marched 200 miles and arrived ready to fight. It did not go well for the Vikings. The sagas record one of the most famous individual acts of the entire Viking age at the bridge itself. A single Norwegian warrior, unnamed, enormous, armed with a great axe, held the narrow bridge against the entire English army while the Norwegian force formed up on the far bank. He killed 40 Englishmen. The crossing was blocked until an English soldier floated under the bridge in a barrel and thrust a spear up through the planking, killing the defender from below. Whether literally true in every detail, the story captures something essential about what Harald Hardrada's army was made of. Before fighting commenced, a conciliatory King Harald offered Tostig his earldom back to lay down his arms. Tostig refused. The battle began. Harald Hardrada fought at the front of his forces without armor, the armor was at the ships. The sagas describe him in a frenzy, wielding his great axe with both hands, cutting down English soldiers, fighting with the fury of a man who understood that the battle was going badly and that personal heroism was the only thing that could still turn it. He was 51 years old. He fought like a man half his age. It was first late in the day when Harald Hardrada's standard fell and the king himself was killed by an arrow through the throat. He fell in the front of the battle, fighting. Not retreating. Not surrendering. He had fought without armor and paid the price. But the price was entirely consistent with who he had been his entire life, a man who led from the front, who shared the danger, who would not ask his warriors to go where he himself would not follow. Harald Hardrada died the way he had lived. At the front. Moving forward. Harald's death was not immediately the end of the battle. Eystein Or, the fiancé of Harald's daughter Maria, arrived with reinforcements from Rickcall. Eystein launched a vicious counterattack that reaped an excessive toll on the weary English army but ultimately lacked the numbers or momentum to break them. When Eystein was killed, the Norwegian army collapsed. The rout was total. The pursuit was merciless. The losses the Norwegians had suffered were so severe that only 24 ships from the fleet of over 300 were needed to carry the survivors away. 300 longships had sailed to England. 24 carried the survivors home. The proportions tell the entire story. It was not merely a defeat. It was annihilation. The most experienced Viking army of the generation had been destroyed in an afternoon by an English king who had marched 200 miles in 4 days to deliver a surprise attack that Harald's army had not seen coming. Among the survivors was Harald's son Olaf, who had stayed with the ships at Rickcall throughout the battle. Harald Godwinson gave him safe passage home. Olaf returned to Norway. He would become its next king. His father remained in English soil. 3 days after the battle, on September 28, 1066, a Norman invasion army led by William the Conqueror landed at Pevensey, Sussex, on the south coast of England. Harald Godwinson turned his exhausted army south. He had won the greatest military victory of his reign. He had no time to rest it. The forced march north to fight Harald, the brutal battle at Stamford Bridge, and then the immediate march south to face William, all of it in less than 3 weeks, is widely considered the primary reason Harald was beaten at Hastings 19 days later. Harald Hardrada had died. But his invasion had still helped change the world. The saga accounts of Harald Hardrada are so dominated by his military achievements that it is easy to miss the man behind the legend. He was not only a warrior. He was a poet. The Norse skaldic tradition valued kings who could compose verse, and Harald was a genuine practitioner. He composed poems about his own campaigns with a combination of self-aggrandizement and self-deprecating wit that suggests a man who could laugh at himself even while celebrating his victories. The Adam of Bremen, who called him the Thunderbolt of the North, also recorded that he was cultured, sophisticated, and intellectually formidable. He had proposed to Elisive of Kiev, the daughter of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, when he was a young mercenary in her father's service, and she had refused him as insufficiently distinguished. He left to accumulate distinction in Byzantium, returned wealthy and famous, and proposed again. She accepted. The determination to win a woman who had rejected him by going out and becoming worth accepting is perhaps the most human story in an otherwise intimidating catalogue of military achievement. He married her. He took her on the invasion of England. She survived Stamford Bridge and returned to Norway. As King of Norway, he was more than a warrior king. He expanded Norwegian colonial possessions in Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides. He developed Norwegian trade and maintained the commercial networks that connected Norway to the wider European and Byzantine world. He built and maintained the institutions of royal administration with the same systematic intelligence he applied to warfare. Norway under Harald was a functioning kingdom, not merely a launching pad for raids. The Thunderbolt of the North was also a builder. It is just harder to write sagas about administration than about battle. The world that followed Harald Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge was shaped, in part, by his failure. Harald Godwinson's forced march north to fight Harald, the brutal battle, and the immediate march south to face William left the English army at Hastings depleted, exhausted, and fighting at a disadvantage that would not have existed if Harald had not forced that sequence of events. William the Conqueror won at Hastings in part because Harald Godwinson had already spent everything he had dealing with Harald. The last Viking's death made the Norman conquest possible. The Norman conquest transformed England permanently. The English language absorbed thousands of French words. The legal system was restructured. The aristocracy was replaced. The architecture of English governance was rebuilt from the ground up. Everything that followed, the Magna Carta, the development of English common law, the particular character of English political culture, was shaped by the Norman presence that William established at Hastings. And Hastings was made possible, in part, by Stamford Bridge. Harald Hardrada did not conquer England. But his failure to do so may have been the most consequential defeat in English history. A year after his death at Stamford Bridge, Harald's body was moved to Norway and buried at the Mary Church in Nidaros. He had come home at last, not as a conqueror of England but as a king of Norway. The country that had exiled him at 15 received him back at 51, dead, having attempted and failed the greatest adventure of his extraordinary life. His son Olaf ruled Norway. His son Magnus had been left behind to rule in his absence. The dynasty continued. The Viking Age did not. Historians mark the death of Harald Hardrada on September 25, 1066 as the end of the Viking Age. The designation is conventional. Vikings did not stop existing the next day, and Scandinavian campaigns in Britain and Ireland continued for decades. But the designation captures something real. Harald was the last figure who embodied the Viking Age in its fullest sense, the warrior king who fought across the entire known world, who accumulated gold through violence and skill, who believed absolutely that the strongest and most daring deserved whatever they could take. That world was ending, and he ended with it. What replaced the Viking Age was a world of dynastic states, feudal hierarchies, and institutional power, the world that William the Conqueror represented, the world that Harald himself had been building in Norway without fully realizing it. The era of the individual warrior king who could make himself a force through personal ability, personal courage, and personal charisma was giving way to the era of institutions, dynasties, and inherited authority. Harald was the last great exemplar of the old model. His failure at Stamford Bridge was not merely a military defeat. It was the old world losing to the new. Harald Hardrada was 15 when he fought his first battle and 51 when he fought his last. In between he served 3 monarchs, crossed 2 continents, accumulated one of the largest private fortunes in the Viking world, became king of Norway, fought Denmark for 15 years, and sailed 300 ships toward England on the last great Viking adventure. He was killed by an arrow through the throat, fighting without armor, at the front of his forces, in an afternoon battle he should never have been caught unprepared for. He was, to the end, exactly what the sagas said he was. The last Viking. And the last of a kind that the world would not see again.